Hello and welcome to Season 10, Episode 10 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We're, of course, reading the Thomas Sowell Reader, reading some of the best articles from Thomas Sowell on all kinds of issues. This time we're finishing up the section on legal issues, another sort of wide-ranging discussion here from healthcare to racism and law enforcement and things like that. It's all sorts of different issues in here. It's been a couple days since I read this chapter, so you might have to refresh my memory a few times as we go through it.
Yeah, it's fresh in my mind because it's just been a couple hours.
That's good.
Yeah. I'm an attorney, so we're always, like up to the deadline. We're procrastinators. Never trust an attorney who's not a procrastinator.
Is that good advice?
Yeah, I guess they're weird.
All right.
They should have been engineers or something. Or maybe it's just the successful lawyers who don't procrastinate. Well, I need to meet a better class of friend. All right, power to the parasites, which is defamatory of all lawyers and plaintiffs' lawyers, really. And he's mentioning that Dow Corning's lawsuits, which were a big thing at the time for leaky fake breasts. That's what he's talking about there, the silicone breasts. And I don't remember, I meant to look up, but I didn't, whether or not any of this was eventually proven, but, he was criticizing the less than stringent evidence that was required of certain personal injury claims. And you see that I guess a more modern example would be Roundup litigation, which they've gotten big verdicts for some people and then defense verdicts for others. As far as whether that causes cancer, and I don't know that it's been proven, and so I mean he's really just kind of talking about the burden of proof and power to the parasites is basically plaintiffs, lawyers, and judges, and these plaintiffs are parasites sucking the money and energy out of the economy.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say I kind of see his point, but at the same time, I don't really care if the breast implant company goes under. This is like the first article I think in this whole chapter that I was just kind of, or this whole book. There's just kind of like, yeah, whatever, man. It's like sure. I mean, I guess you can argue you need a better burden of proof, but also I don't really care if Dow Corning goes out of business because I don't think that's really a great business to have. But
yeah. Well, I think Dow Corning, I thought they were a fiberglass manufacturer back in the day, insulation. The Dow Chemical Company, which may be just a different company, has a big plant in Peevely area. Still, they make that pink insulation, I think is Dow. Pink foam insulation, that kind of stuff. But yeah, I don't know that he's saying that particular defendant is, an ideal defendant. And that's part of the problem, is that's really what he's kind of describing is if you're a disfavored defendant, then these, scavengers come out. But I agree that when I read this, I was like, yeah, it almost seems a little angry in his tone, which is a little more emotional than he is with other topics. Like he says, the quote on the second page of this, no society ever thrived because it had a large and growing class of parasites living off of those who produce. And I guess that's true, but even with his rather blunt language, I thought this particular article was a little over the top. Of course, I'm a lawyer though, so maybe I just read it differently. I think he's right about a more broad point about people over analyzing, legal claims. I always get asked, questions from people. Well, doesn't that create liability? I'm like, well, no. Okay. Like there's so many, especially like in a municipal setting, because there's sovereign immunity and I'll be asked, well, if we approve this, won't that create liability? Like if we approve this, this rezoning request, doesn't that create liability? No. I mean, it doesn't create liability. How can somebody sue you? I mean, although they can sue if you inappropriately, another property owner can, but not the world at large. You're not responsible for how they build it. And that's really the question is, well, if we approve this and they don't build it right, do we have liability? How do you even figure that? Why do you even think that? But it's because everybody sues everybody, and you can't watch. I can't watch my favorite shows in the evening, which are I'm already being bombarded with because I watch old man shows like Rockford Files, which I was so lazy Sunday. I went out. It was out a little late Monday or Saturday night. I was so lazy. I watched Rockford Files for 5 hours.
Oh my God.
and,
Most
and
impressive.
so the TV commercials for Rockford Files are
Uh-huh.
reverse mortgages, Medicare supplemental plans, hearing aid companies, and some personal injury. Oh yeah, and now the big one is those stand up baths, like the
Huh.
bathtubs, like or the sit down baths. They're kind of stand up, where like you get in it,
Hmm.
and you walk in it. It has like a door, and you walk in it and you kind of sit down, half sit down, kind of, and then you close the door and it seals, and then it fills up with water like a hot tub.
Really?
Yeah, and then it has to drain out, of course, and then you can walk out. So you don't have to step out of the tub,
Huh.
and you're not like laying down because old people have a hard time getting in and out of tubs.
Hmm.
So I'm thinking about buying one.
I don't think that would go over too well.
I actually checked the pricing. I'm too cheap. But they have jets on them and stuff, and it's the perfect position to read a book in
Uh,
the bath because it's like you're sitting in a recliner, but you have jets going. Put some bubbles in there, it'd be great.
that's
But
ridiculous. That's
anyway, when I watch
ridiculous.
Rockford Files in the evenings, they have different commercials,
Sure.
and those are all like, "Have you been injured?
Mhm. Yes.
We're gonna get what you deserve." All that
Hmm.
kind of stuff.
Yeah. So I mean, I
Sorry
think
about that
he's
little.
no, that's not. No, I mean that ties in. 'Cause I think he's generally right that people are way too eager to sue everybody. So I think for that
Yeah,
point he's right, but for why he got so invested on this particular article, it just seems strange. It seemed very out of the ordinary. Like
yeah,
he is usually pretty blunt with his language, but it seems strange for this particular one.
yeah,
But I mean that ties
and
in
yeah,
essentially his argument in the next article too, talking about medical lawsuits. And then essentially
mm,
there's just a complete lack of trust between doctors and their patients. Says a lot of that is because people are so eager to sue their doctors at any given point in time, that doctors really sort of go to extreme lengths to take every possible measure to make sure that there's no possible risk of anything. Like the story he tells was testing just to see if he has cancer. And he says, the doctor weighed the risk. And he's kind of an older guy at this point. He says, well, there's a risk of infection if we give you this test. And if we don't give you this test, well, we won't know for sure if you have cancer. And so then the doctor, there's a good amount of trust between him and his doctor. And the doctor said, yeah, we're just not going to do the test, right?
yeah,
The risk of you having cancer is not worth the risk of you getting infected from this test. Just the possibility of testing for it isn't worth the risk of you getting infected. So you don't know if you have
yeah.
cancer, but
And the example is a little bit different, where there was a two stage test.
right.
So you do the first, and then you decide based upon that whether you do the second test, which has some risk. And so his doctor, like you said, explained, well, you don't even need to have it. And he mentions it, which I think is really is remembered by a lot of people. I think even jurors, the patient doesn't have a right to infallibility from the doctor. There's a certain amount of risk, and this was before that there was a big sweeping change in a lot of states for tort reform with medical malpractice. I will say this: he's right about, like, he gives an example of like the trust you have in your family doctor, and you knew they weren't infallible, but there's a trust there because you get patients by referral as opposed to whether the doctor's in plan or out of plan, and so they kind of get filtered through this other selection process, which a doctor made a point that he's talking. That's a friend of his that made this point about. There was a lot more trust between us, and now it's almost adversarial.
Yeah.
And so then they're going to order more tests just to protect them. And I think that's absolutely true. I think it's also absolutely true. And there's been a movement to. It's also absolutely true that doctors won't be honest about their mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's another big problem about the separation of the relationship between patient and doctor. In a small town, the doctor screws up, the doctor's going to say, "I'm sorry, I screwed up." And there's been a push in recent years it's kind of controversial whether or not doctors should actually just admit it,
Yeah.
immediately after. And they found that when they do, um, it tends to reduce the number of claims, because a
Hmm.
lot of times the family just wants to know the truth, and they understand that the doctors are not infallible, and they're not omniscient. And if they say, hey, we screwed up or whatever, of course but then you've basically admitted liability. So if there is not that trust between the patient and the doctor, the patient is going to say, oh, payday, so, and then you got to go through that litigation process. But I've seen the same kind of trend in the legal field. I've been in private practice for 18 years. That means part of my job is sales, getting
Yeah.
people to hire me. And thankfully I'm in the stage of my career where I can say, no, I'm not taking your case because you're a jerk.
Yeah.
And I found, my list is, it keeps expanding on the things that if you say in my introductory consultation, if you say these things, I won't take your case. One of them, which I've more recently added, was if you complain about lawyers generally during the initial consultation, I'm walking,
Yeah.
because if you're going to do that before you even hire me, then you're going to hate me later for some reason.
Mhm.
And it always turns out that way. That you have unreasonable expectations or whatever. But certainly if you're already have a lawyer, or you had a lawyer, and all you do is complain about the previous lawyer, that was a previous rule. If you ever utter the words, it's not about the money, to me, I don't want your case, because what the hell you hire me for? It's
Mhm.
about the money. I can't bring that back or whatever. It's you're hiring me to get the money.
Mhm.
Be honest about it. And if they say, oh, it's just the principle, and I've had people angry with me because they will say, I will pay you whatever it takes to take this case on. And I won't do it.
Hmm.
And you'll say, well, Mark, why would you ever say that? Because they're lying. They're lying to themselves
Yeah.
initially. I don't think they're lying to me, but and this is how I explained it to people. And I've explained this to people like every couple months. They'll come in. It's not about the money. It's this and that, and it's usually like a neighbor dispute where they hate their neighbors and they're making noise or whatever. And I won't take them. And I'll tell them, this is not God's honest truth. I'll say, look, right now, me. Some of them I know them from church or whatever, or I've been recommended. So I said, like, right now, me and you like me because you came here and you're trying to hire me. And I think that's great. And that's wonderful. It's nice to know somebody respects me and likes me and wants to hire me. And they're like nodding along. I say, but if I take this case and I don't think I can win this case, or the money you'd have to pay me is not going to be money well spent,
Yeah.
certainly 6 months from now, you'll be unhappy with me because now you're paying me and you're not getting anything out of it. And now you hate me.
Mhm.
Okay. So right now you think I'm the bee's knees. 6 months from now, if I take this case, you will hate me. I don't need any more people hating me. I've got plenty already. All right. I don't need to add you to the list. Oh no, Mark, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, no, I'm telling you that's going to happen.
Yeah.
So you can hire a different lawyer to hate in 6 months. And when I explain it that way, and they'll say, "No, really, ha ha ha," and I'm like, "No, really, I'm not taking
Yeah.
your case."
Yeah.
So I think his point is well taken in any professional field. I'm sure this article that he wrote would resonate with any professional, that you need that kind of trust, you need that kind of relationship, and if you don't, then you don't want them as a
Yeah.
customer. And I think the problem with doctors is they have to take them.
Yeah. I think he's absolutely right too, that just with the increased bureaucracy, the more layers you have to go through to
Yeah,
get there, just the more adversarial it's going to become, because you just lose, because it's just greater degrees of separation between you and your doctor, right?
yep,
Just all the hoops you have to jump through, and it just becomes much easier to start hating and distrusting that person because there's so
yep,
many other people involved in the thing. You start to like just not even have that sort of relationship with the person who's taking care of your health.
yeah. And that's another good thing about being a small town lawyer, because you'll know. And it's also bad because if you screw up, then they know where you
Everybody
live.
knows.
Like they'll see you at church or the grocery store or whatever. And so it's another good reason not to take a cranks case. But it also means that you're more likely to know who the cranks are, and you won't even take the calls.
There you go.
But like a small town doctor, you would know those people. Like, oh, you go to Dr. Smith. Well, he's gonna charge me double. Yeah, I would too.
Mm.
Because Dr. Smith knows you're a jerk. Anyhow.
Yes.
It was a good article, I thought.
Yeah, yeah. And the next one's really good too, because he says he starts off the first line. He says it was a classic line from the New York Times: "How America raises the children of inner cities may be the ultimate test of the country's political and economic arrangements." And essentially, his argument in here is, well, that doesn't make any sense. America is not the one who is
Mm.
raising these children. You see this time and time again in all of these magazines, all these essays, where it's like America has failed the population. And he points out a little bit later, he's talking mostly about, inner city, young people and stuff like that, people who end up, going into crime and things like that. He's like, okay, well, then what about all the people who grew up in those inner cities and were successful? Did America fail them? Did they grow up in a foreign country and then move back to America? How does that work? How does America fail some and not, fail others if they're coming from the same group of people? And he says, this is a good line here. He says, the steady drumbeat of blame society, hate America talk is all too typical of the mindset that has led to the destruction of both moral values and law enforcement over the past 30 years. And he particularly points out the New York Times as the biggest culprit of that. And I think he's spot on with this one, that it's so much easier just to blame, the society or the country at large and say, well, this is responsible, rather than looking into the actual situation and things like that. It's much easier to just say, no, I hate this country, I hate, the society, and that's why things are bad.
Yeah, and it's a great article, and he segues into the people that talk about root causes for crime, and that's really what he's talking about. Like it's kind of like you dissolve or you release the focus on individual responsibility, and you blame the society for an individual's decisions with regard to committing crime, or how we're dealing with them. And of course, he hates the Warren Court, which expanded all these rights for defendants. And he does cite statistics that show after that, like, the crime rate went up. And I think it's not just from the court decisions; it's a lot of public policy at the same time. Um, and I don't know if he coined this phrase, but he doesn't. He's not quoting it from somebody else, but he might have coined this phrase, which I love, which is where he's talking about those um, liberal, criminal justice type advocates, where he says liberals are often wrong, but never in doubt. And
Pretty
that
good.
is so true, and it's true to this day, isn't it? And that's what's been so entertaining for the last 2 weeks, which seems like 2 decades
Mhm.
that Trump has been president. Or is it 3 weeks? I think it's less than 3 weeks, isn't it?
Yeah, I think
I
it's
don't
two,
know.
right? Because it's the 20th, January
Yeah,
20th. Yeah,
it seems
it's 2 weeks.
like forever ago. But the people that criticize him for the things he does, and they're criticizing him so stupidly because they're never in doubt
Yeah.
that they're right, but they're so often wrong about some of the things on the merits, that it's just. And right this term, he's just plowing forward. He's like,
Yeah.
I don't care what you say. What are you gonna do? Vote
Yeah.
against me?
That's
Too
one of
late.
the that's one of the big things with like the hate America crowd right now, which
Yeah.
is so wild. Because we're actually seeing deportations of illegal aliens who've come into the country. They're saying, well, no, this is terrible. We can't, kick them out. We can't have them, sent back to where they came from. And
Yeah.
yet they're the same people who are saying this society is horrible and evil and awful to its core and racist towards all of these people. And so
Yeah.
you can't have both of those at the same time. Like, if America is so awful, wouldn't it be better for those people to be going back? And it's the same thing with the new discussion on USAID, which nobody had ever heard of or paid any attention to for the last like 20 years, at least among young people. But now you have all of these people who are saying, well, no, it's if we cut back on U.S. foreign aid, so many countries are going to collapse, their healthcare, things like that we're funding and we're supporting. And that's just like, okay, well, that's also completely at odds with the rhetoric that America is horrible and evil and doesn't care about anybody.
Yes.
So it's
Right.
like, either are we propping up every single country's infrastructure in the world, or are we evil? And it's like, you want us to keep doing these things that we've been doing that make us, good in some way in your eyes, but then you're also saying it's the most evil society to ever exist in history.
Yeah. The USAID has been known among really knowledgeable conservative fiscal conservatives for decades, I guess.
Yeah.
It's been known to me. Now, the nature and extent,
Hmm.
the amounts, it's just so unbelievable how much money is flowing. But I don't know if they stumbled upon this as the root cause of most of the world's political misery in the West,
Hmm.
or if they planned it from the beginning. It seems like that they put this administrative order in place to suspend all spending, grant spending, and money going out for whatever grants from ever agencies. They did that. And so what they're saying is they did that, and USAID defied that the most.
Yeah.
And so they went to that first. And
Mm.
that may be true. I mean, I don't think they're lying about that. And then the numbers were staggering of how they were still just shipping the money out the door. But the reason why the Democrats are so upset about this is because this funds their entire political structure,
Yeah.
both in the United States and internationally. And that agency is most responsible for the wealthiest zip codes
Mm.
being the three around Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
If the money flows into that, flows out to these NGOs, flows into left wing employees, and they donate, a portion back to
Yeah.
fundraise for the PACs for Democrats and individual candidates for Democrats.
Yeah.
It's much like Scott Walker's union funding reforms back in Wisconsin that starved the Democratic Party of these government subsidized political donations. And if Musk and Trump and the rest of those young guys that are fighting a good fight get that thing shut down so that we're actually doing legitimate foreign aid, which is fine,
Mm.
as long as it helps people and supports American interests and not just left wing causes against everyone, including Hungary.
Mm.
And like even like El Salvador, Bukele or whatever his name is, he posted today about how they funded his opposition. Hungary stated the same thing. It went through a particular, they're saying we the right wing has been talking about George Soros all this time, but George Soros is just one of the funders. The big funder for a lot of the Soros prosecutors are actually the federal government through these NGOs. So
I saw earlier today it was tracing, I forget the name of the institute or whatever it was that received a bunch of USAID money, but it came directly from, the federal government to this institute, who then gave massive donations to BLM. And of course,
yes,
BLM was one of the big donators to all these Democrat candidates for such a long time. And even just aside from just the money funneling back into Democrat pockets, some of these, initiatives were just so over the top ridiculous.
yes,
Like I was thinking, there's no way this is real. One of them was promoting atheism in Nepal. It was like
yes, yes,
$50,000 and transgender operas, things like that. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And I think that's another reason why it's so smart to be going after this so early, is you're making all these Democrats, die on this hill of no, we have to keep this agency. This is like a big one that we have to keep. And a lot of them are real up in arms about it. I think mostly because of the money funneling thing. But now they're also defending
oh
all of
yeah.
these absolutely ridiculous initiatives.
Well, it's like cutting off the water to a vineyard.
Yeah.
They're going to die on the vine.
Hmm.
And I think the danger, though, to Trump, and he may be realizing this, is that there's a lot of Republican congressmen and senators that are getting kickbacks in this.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's been as reported as much in the conservative press, but you'll see, well, like Bill Kristol, who used to be a conservative. I don't know what the hell he is now, but he's the president of some NGO that's been funded to the tunes of millions of dollars. Well, you just know that he's just pocketing that
Yeah.
for whatever truthism or whatever the heck his that business is. But I think you're going to see Lindsey Graham is probably a affiliate with some of these, some of these other senators who are, you're like, why are they voting for this, or why are they opposed to that? We're going to find out. There's administrator of the funds. I don't think there's any doubt that Trump can not award grants.
Yeah.
Can just stop the funding, and that would at least slow down that funding of the opposition, the disloyal opposition. It's getting back to his topics, which is the legal and the criminal side of it. The massive funding of these anti-police and organizations and these pro-criminal organizations, not just the illegal immigrants, but the other ones, for these massive demonstrations. It's been known since before BLM
Hmm.
that these protests were professionally funded.
Yeah.
And the big ones were literally, like at the Ferguson riots, there'd be a delivery of a pallet of bricks in nearby. Somebody would order and that's not cheap.
Yeah.
So who paid for that? And then people show up with all these printed and manufactured political signs. I mean, that's thousands of dollars in for people that are unemployed,
Hmm.
for the most part, or certainly underemployed. They don't have money to throw around like that. Somebody's been funding these things, and I think if anybody actually followed the money, it's going to coming from all of us through. A lot of this is USAID.
Yeah.
Crazy.
And that kind of ties
So
into the next
yes,
article here. Speaking of, those sorts of riots and defunding the police, the next article is "Are Cops Racist?" And this is essentially, I mean, he's kind of touched on a lot of these points before, but
yeah,
he's really talking about this book from Heather McDonald titled "Are Cops Racist?" He's just saying, look at the ridiculous statistics that they use to try and push this narrative. And the example he uses to try to compare these things, he says, suppose I were to tell you that, despite the fact that blacks are just 11% of the American population, more than half the men fined for misconduct while playing professional basketball are black, and concluded that this shows the NBA to be racist, what would your reaction be? He says,
right.
well, yeah, of course that's ridiculous because it's a higher percentage within the NBA, who are playing. So of course more of them would be fined than would be just a percentage of the general population. He says, well, that's exactly the same thing that we're looking at with these statistics. You have to put things in perspective and not just take it all at face value of whatever the story is trying to be spun.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because there's been mandatory reporting I forget what they call it, but it's the racial components of traffic stops
Hmm.
that they published for many years. I don't know if they're still doing it now. I think they still have the reports, um, but it begs the question. Okay, well, if you're just recording the traffic stops, and what they would compare it to is the racial percentages that live in that particular jurisdiction, and if that's out of whack with the number of people they pull over, then there's this allegation that there's racism. Well, but then it begs the question. Well, I mean, and this is a question: are African Americans more or less likely to have their car plates expired?
Hmm.
And if the answer to that is significantly yes, there's a significantly higher percentage of people with expired plates that are black than are other races, they're going to get pulled over more often.
Yeah.
And so that's a meaningful um, difference. Now, if they deviate from that and they're pulling people over for expired plates disproportionate to the number of people that have expired plates and are driving around the roads, well, then that would show that more so that, well, they're just not paying attention to crimes committed by other races,
Hmm.
and they're focusing on blacks. And I think that's primarily the argument,
Yeah.
is what they're saying. That this is what evidence is showing, but it's always a correlation, not causation, because they don't control for those other factors. It's kind of like the wage gap, where you say, well, women are only paid 70 cents on the dollar for the same quality of work as men. Well, that's just not true, because if you control for the other factors as far as hours worked and all that kind of stuff, as we all know now, then it's a meaningless statistic, because it doesn't control for all these other variables. And the same thing is true about these about the discriminatory effect. And I'm not saying that there aren't racist cops, and I'm not saying there's not problem cops, um, but it's overstated and underproved.
Hmm.
There should be, but the danger, there should be legitimate controlled studies looking into all these factors so we can get an accurate picture of it. But it's a dangerous undertaking for somebody who's a criminologist, because they kind of know that there's going to be some disparity in the relative population commission of crimes.
Hmm.
Um, and so if you establish that, your career will be destroyed. If you establish that blacks commit crimes at higher rates, whether they're whether people are charged appropriately overall, as correcting for race.
And that's what he mentions
Yeah,
in the
correct.
article. He says a professor of statistics who pointed this out was all too predictably denounced as a racist. Other
Yeah.
statisticians kept quiet for fear of being smeared the same way. We have now reached the dangerous point where ignorance can silence knowledge and where facts get squelched by beliefs. And
Oh,
that's very, very
100%.
true.
Yeah.
Very, very true.
Yeah, and it's super unfortunate because it really it's funny. I think we all know how to fix the problem. And the first step is like for higher crime areas, the first step is to admit what the problem is
Mhm.
and to face it head on and go to the people that are causing the problems and deal with them both positively and with positive and negative reinforcement, right? And that means like in our neck of the my neck of the woods, it means going into certain mobile home parks, really, providing services for people that can help and crushing and incarcerating the people that need to be incarcerated. And so they have a safe place to live. The others have a safe place to live. And I mean, that's fairly simple, but you have to instill in people the value of work, and the value of a two-parent household. I mean, that the two-parent households like this solves 90% of our social ills in our country. I mean,
Yeah.
it's crazy how successful everybody is as an intact mother and father through the entire youth of the child. I mean, if you have mother and father in the house, of course, that presupposes that it's not abusive and all that kind of stuff, because otherwise it's not going to last. Um, but I mean, that's really the solution, and it's but you can't really look at that in any honest way with regard to certain and it's not caused by. I don't need to suggest it's caused by the race, but I think there's a certain criminal subculture
Hmm.
in some subcultures within the white community, and certainly in some subcultures of the African American community. Not all of them, but there's like it's funny. I finally read Hillbilly Elegy.
Oh, yeah.
Guthrie is really good,
Mm.
and he talks about the culture of the hillbillies, and how you're acting. If you did well in school, you weren't acting like a man. You're somehow feminized,
Mm.
and that's a destructive cultural attitude, obviously. So that needs to be addressed honestly. But
Yeah.
good luck.
Mm.
Maybe I mean, hell, with how much the world is changing last
They're just the
couple
2 weeks.
weeks.
Yeah.
Maybe in 2 months we'll have already crossed that hurdle.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts? I've kind of monopolized the
No, no,
discussion.
no, no. That was good. The next article though I thought was good as well, where he tells the story. It's called "The Meaning of Law."
Yeah.
It's focused on the story of Ellie Nestler, who killed the man who sexually abused her child, and she killed him because he just was not getting the justice that he deserved. That's essentially his argument here. He says he was already arrested in the past for sexual molestation, but then was basically just let off the hook with some sort of token punishment. And his argument throughout is, we've made it, increasingly difficult for justice to actually be had in criminal law, because he says, for more than a century and a half after the Constitution was written, the greatest legal minds in the history of the Supreme Court failed to discover these new criminal, quote, rights discovered by intellectual lightweights and ideological zealots on the High Court during the past 30 years. He's saying we keep just trying to make up new rights that just lead to less justice and just lead to more criminals being let off for really no good reason. And so that's what's been leading to people wanting to take things into their own hands if they don't see this justice being carried out. And of course, he discusses a little bit in there how there's sort of hypocrisy for people who are now, very, very aggressively against, this woman who would defend, other criminals who've gotten off in the past. And, well, they just didn't have justice for them. And that's why they committed, this crime. He says, well, we have to actually look at what's going on here in all of these cases. But I thought it was a good article here.
No, it's great, and he's absolutely right. And I think if Trump had not been elected, I think we were getting closer and closer to almost organized vigilantes. I'm not saying that it existed yet, but at some point, if the criminal justice system won't address dangerous, violent criminals, you're going to have a private security, even informal groups going out and beating and killing people.
Yeah.
Because at some point you have to protect your community or your family. And I think, quite frankly, I think vigilante justice, and I've mentioned this in the podcast before, in the African American community is run rampant now because they don't believe that the criminal justice system will successfully prosecute the other shooters and murderers. And some of it's cultural, not to be, snitches get stitches or whatever from the 80s. It's now like a philosophy of life, I guess. But but it's um, but it's real, because can you really trust St. Louis City to get significant time for an armed robbery? Even like say so they don't shoot you, they just steal your car at gunpoint. Is that guy really going to go to prison?
Mhm.
In Jefferson County, where I am at, 100%. The guy's going to prison. It's just a matter of how long. St. Louis City, ooh, I doubt it.
Yeah.
I think probation's on the table.
Hmm.
And if that happens more than a few times, and it gives free rein to people to rob, and then it also creates an incentive for the victims not to report to the police. Why bother?
Yeah.
Why deal with the inconvenience? Why don't you just go over there and shoot them?
Yeah, I really like how he ends this
That'll
article.
learn them.
Yeah, he says, if we're going to condemn people who take the law into their own hands, let us start with those who are sworn to uphold the law, who
Yes.
cold-bloodedly decide to twist that law to their own purposes, not with an overwrought mother whose child has been victimized because the law was lax. It's like all
Yes.
you people who are saying, oh, she shouldn't have done this, you should have waited for the criminal justice system to sort things out. Well, if she's taking the law into her own hands, then clearly these judges, these Supreme Court judges in the past, have much more directly taken the law into their own hands because they're just
Yes.
pushing for ideology, just sort of reading new things into the Constitution that were never thought of before, and that's really the bigger problem here.
Yeah, did you ever see the video of the guy? He's in the airport. His son was had his son's coach. I forget what sport it was molesting him. Took him to another state, and
Mhm.
um, and then they were extradited him back to the state to
Yeah,
be
I've seen the
prosecuted.
video.
And the father was acting like he's at the payphone, turns around and takes 2 steps forward and shoots a guy right in the head and kills him.
Yeah,
And I think he might have got probation. He
yeah.
didn't get much time.
Mhm.
The killer, I think he argued sudden passion. I don't know how sudden it was. It's pretty deliberate. But I think in that jurisdiction, they're like, it saved us some time and trouble, I guess.
Yeah,
Because the guy was unapologetic. He's just
yeah.
like, what are you going to do to me? Oh, I'm going to shoot you in the head, I guess. And that's, and you see those guys that taunt victims in the courtroom
Hmm.
after the loved ones have been killed. That just calls out, it's a begging for vigilante justice.
For
So,
sure.
it creates, when you have high crime areas, like in New York, Bernie Getz, have you ever heard of him?
I don't
He
think
was,
so.
before you were born, of course, but he was on the subway and he shot 5 guys, I think. He got tired of getting hassled in the subway and getting robbed.
Hmm.
And he wasn't supposed I don't think it was legal to have a concealed gun, but he did. And I don't know how many he killed, but he was either acquitted or he wasn't charged. I can't
Wow.
remember. It was so many years ago. And he was, he might have got a little carried away. But even, at that time, the people were like calling him a hero. Like
Yeah,
finally somebody did something about these, kind of like Daniel Penny, but Daniel Penny was actually, he seemed pretty
much more
reasonable about
restrained.
it.
Yeah.
And that guy died, but they prosecuted him, which is crazy. So then you're like, why won't these guys stand up for me? Are you crazy? Uh, as they say, equal rights and equal lefts. Like, uh, yeah, you're a woman, defend yourself.
Yeah. Oh, that's blood.
Which I don't, I think that's wrong, but I mean, there's a hazard there in
Yeah.
those jurisdictions to stepping forward and to protect somebody else's, and you're in the middle of it.
Yeah.
Anyway, on to that, to freedom versus democracy, which
I think this
is
was the
kind of
best
like the
one.
same.
Yeah.
Really? Yeah.
I thought this was one of at least one of the best articles that we've discussed here. Because essentially his argument is that democracy does not 100% like one-to-one equal freedom. That's what a lot of
Yes.
people think now, but that's really not the case. You can live in a democracy that's horribly totalitarian, you don't have any freedom at all. You can live under a monarchy that's actually has a lot of freedom and allows you to freely
Yes.
participate in society. And that's the way, I don't think he talks about it too much in here, but that's the way, most of Europe functioned for a very long time.
Yes.
And those people weren't really like subjugated. Like every once in a while, there'd be a bad king for sure, but you would still have freedom in those societies. And I think
Well,
yeah,
he mentions Great Britain,
yeah,
or yeah,
Hong
that
Kong, yeah,
but before they had the right to vote, they had independent judiciary, free speech, and jury trials.
hmm
And I think about that a lot. You know, like we had this big experiment in Iraq and Afghanistan and all that, trying to force our type of constitutional representative democracy on those societies. And I think it probably would have been much better to have their tribal structure,
hmm
even though it was discriminatory and not democratic, but with these kind of protections for
yeah,
individual rights and right to a jury trial. Now, a jury of your peers would be 12 dudes, and I mean, of course, local Muslims, so
mhm,
they would not reach the same verdicts that we would,
yeah,
but you would have some protections.
hmm
And now they have nothing, of course, because we're not there, and it's just back to what they had before. And maybe something along those lines might have worked.
yeah.
Um, and
It
I
seems
don't
like
know.
this was written before, a lot of the nation building in the Middle East, because he doesn't mention that in
Yes,
sort of the list of areas. He says, whether in
right.
Eastern Europe and the Balkans, between the two world wars, or in Africa in the post-war era, many newly created democratic governments collapsed into authoritarianism or worse. It is much easier to imitate the outward institutional forms of Western democracy than to synthesize the centuries of tradition that make those institutions work. And this is a
Yes,
great point, and this is something we talked about a lot. Was that just last season with Orestes Bronson? With his
yes,
argument that like you have to have that culture that sort of naturally develops first before you can just create government out of nothing, right? Government doesn't
yes,
spring from nowhere. You have to have the appropriate sort of cultural situation if you want to have a specific type of government. And every people essentially in some way has a government that's fitting to them. For the most part, was a lot of his
yeah,
arguments. Well, yeah, we can't just planted a completely different system on them. This system that's developed naturally over 1,500 years. Like here, surprise, we're gonna build this nation from the ground up according to this completely different system that you have no experience with and have no desire to be a part of because it doesn't reflect who you are as a people. It
yeah,
doesn't reflect anything you actually want. So in some ways, it's even more undemocratic because it's pushing democracy on them when they didn't even want it.
yes,
You get to decide because we told you that you get to decide. It's
yeah,
kind of ridiculous.
yeah. And this is an argument I often forget.
Mhm.
I know this is true, and he's so brilliant how he describes it. But it's like, would it be better to be like what are those? There's some celebrities that go to like those Gulf monarchies, and they say, "Ah, it's the greatest ever," because they have no crime and it's clean and all that kind of stuff. And of course, you don't have you can never be a citizen there. You can never vote. So
Mhm.
there's zero democracy for you. But for argument's sake, let's say there's some rule of law and so I don't know their system, but let's say there is a rule of law. So if you are charged with a crime, you have some right to a trial or a jury or something like that. If you have those, but you have no right to vote, but you have some protections in the system, is that better than a different country that has just mob rule and we all get in the arena and we vote and the majority rules with no protections for individuals and they can order your execution by majority vote? Well, I'd much rather have the first system
Mhm.
than the
No,
second system because at some point they're going to get around to me. Um, and so that's such a brilliantly simple reminder that freedom, that democracy doesn't equal freedom. You might get freedom with democracy or through democracy, but they're not parallels. They're not duplicates of each other, you know?
yeah, he makes another good point here. It's really relevant to what we were talking about earlier with, international aid. He says our insistence on at least a charade of democracy is dangerous in another way to ourselves. Relations among nations, especially among the great powers, are not matters of personal friendship or international social work. Their primary goal is, or should be, the safety of the American people in a world that has always been dangerous, long before the Cold War came and went. And that's, just especially relevant right now. It's like, no, the main goal of American foreign policy shouldn't be to provide for every single government, every single, need of people around the world. Like, we can help with some of that if we have the means to, but that shouldn't be our primary goal for the American government. The American government's primary goal is for the safety of the American people. That is what we that is what we are made for. The government's made for.
Supposedly.
Supposedly, yeah. Again, if that actually happens, who knows? But yeah, then we go into the last section here. This one was also really good. This one was much longer,
Yes.
but this was really fantastic. it's titled Judicial Activism and Judicial Restraint. And this one was really good. This is just to briefly summarize the whole article here. It says that the terms judicial activism and judicial restraint have really been misapplied recently. We think that any time a judge wields power in any way, that's judicial activism. And so for a long time, the conservatives were criticizing the liberals because, they were, actually sort of reading things into the Constitution that weren't there. And that's what he says. That's what actual judicial activism is, when you're just making up new things. And of course, when conservatives started to take more power in the Supreme Court, they started to undo a lot of that. And then
Yes.
the liberals were like, well, that's judicial activism. You're making too many decisions. But he says, well, no, it's actually the opposite. That is judicial restraint. You're taking more power away from the Supreme Court. 'Cause you're saying, no, we didn't actually have the right to say this in the first place. And a lot of this reminded me of the Dobbs decision
Yeah.
with overturning Roe v. Wade. Because you had all the liberals saying, well, this is just, the Supreme Court's usurping power and making that decision for everybody. It's like, no, it's
Yeah.
actually taking power away from themselves because they're saying we had no authority to issue this law for the whole country in the first place. We had no authority to do that. It wasn't in the Constitution just to provide for abortion, nationwide. We had no authority. We're removing that authority from ourselves. But they look at that and said, you made a decision, therefore it's judicial activism.
Yeah, and it's astounding that any lawyer can utter those words or
Yeah.
even have those thoughts, but they do either because they're dishonest or because they're stupid.
Hmm.
I mean, when the court overturns an overreach of a previous court, it's not activism. It's a return to normalcy, really, and it's judicial restraint because the judge is restraining their own power.
Hmm.
And the same is true when they overturn the Chevron decision, where
Yeah.
they're saying, no, we're going to restrain the power of the centralized government and force the legislature to make laws appropriately according to the Constitution. So there's all this other activist accord, and I think we're going to see a few more of those decisions in the next few years. I think the birthright citizenship is going to be an interesting decision, and I think that's going to be a little bit of a mixed bag. But I think they're going to ratify that children of illegal immigrants are not in any way citizens in the United States, and that certainly should be their ruling.
Hmm.
Just because they're born here, if they're not subject to the jurisdiction of the court or the jurisdiction of the country because they're here illegally, and they should have been deported or they should never been here, then they
Hmm.
have no right to be a citizen. So, but we're going to see, but it's the same kind of weird, bizarro argument. It's like bizarro world, like the alternate universe, the anti-universe. It's like, well, no, we're going to say that you're activists and you're doing these radical things. Well, no, you've and it's a difference between a revolution and a counter-revolution.
Hmm.
Like right now, we're kind of beginning the counter-revolution in the United States, and that's really what's going on. There's been this, they called it the counter-revolution in the '60s, the counterculture,
Yeah.
but really it was a destructive revolution of American society in the '60s, '70s, and then kind of held at bay in the '80s and early '90s, and then it just went wild in the
Hmm.
2000s. So that revolution has come to maybe a screeching halt or at least a pause.
Yeah.
And we're now seeing the counter revolution, which is a return to, some standards that existed prior to the 1960s march through the institutions.
Yeah, I think it's really funny to see that when people are like, well, the Department of Government Overreach, DOJ, isn't in the Constitution. They don't have any authority to do this. It's like, okay, well, yeah, USAID isn't in the Constitution either. It's like all of these federal agencies that have been created over the past 100 to 60 years roughly. Most of those just are not in the Constitution.
Yeah,
Um,
where's the FBI, by
yeah,
the
they
way?
didn't have any authority to exist really in that right. And if the executive branch has the power to create these things sort of just on a whim, then they have the power to remove them as well if it's all under the executive branch. I mean, I think it's absolutely coherent in that sense. But people are like, well, no, he's abusing this power and he's shaping the U.S. in a completely different direction. It's like, well, no, he's actually just kind of drawing things back and he's actually removing more power from the executive branch.
It's a really interesting issue about the impoundment of funds.
Hmm.
And I don't know how the Supreme Court's going to come out on that. I assume they're going to figure out a way to say that's a political issue. We're not going to get in the middle between the legislature and the president because if just because Congress, of course, appropriates all funds, and certainly the president can't spend money that hasn't been appropriated. I don't think there's any argument about that.
Yeah.
But the question is, well, if you appropriate the money, do I have to spend it as the
Yeah.
president? And he's saying, I don't have to spend that. That's crazy. And you can't make me.
Hmm.
And I think that's going to be a very interesting case. And I would expect that ultimately the Supreme Court will say, yeah, it's a really interesting argument. And if you think that he's not doing his job right, then there's this thing in the Constitution called impeachment. You've done it 3 times. Maybe you can, or is it 3 times? Is he impeached 3 times
I
or
think
2 times?
two at least.
Yeah,
I
I
think
think
they're gonna go
they
for.
all run together. Isn't that crazy? We don't even know. And I pay attention to that. I know it was
I don't know.
two.
I think
Um,
I don't think he got a third.
okay. Well, I know there was
Well, because the
the
impeachments then turned into
Russia.
like actual like lawsuits eventually.
Yeah.
Because all the impeachments were really towards the end of his term. Well, the
Yeah, well,
successful.
I guess he had the one that was after January 6th. I
Yeah.
mean, he wasn't convicted anyway. But they're going to say, yeah, if he's not doing his job right, impeach him.
Hmm.
Remove him. Congress can remove him with no other branch of government being involved,
Yeah.
except for the Chief Justice has to preside over the trial. But, if it's such a big deal, you have the power of the purse strings, then don't spend money on the stuff that he wants to spend money on,
Yeah.
or impeach him and get him out there and get somebody else in there that will do it. I hope and pray the Supreme Court would rule that way. And I think it's the correct thing to do because if he's going to be administering the funds, who else is going to get a process the checks?
Hmm.
The entire executive branch is underneath him, which the FBI and the Department of Justice tried to deny under Biden when they were prosecuting Trump.
Yeah.
They're learning the hard way now,
Hmm.
and it'll be interesting to see how far they go with this FBI stuff,
For sure.
which is still an illegal issues kind of general topic. But I'm shocked that they're going as far as they are
Yeah.
so fast.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm
uh,
impressed.
it's wild,
Yeah.
and they almost have to because of the internal usurpation of President Trump the first go round.
Hmm.
I think he knows he's just got to rip them out and
Yeah.
he's got to go to war with them because they went to war against him. And like, that crazy Vin guy,
Hmm.
it was just basis for the first impeachment, which literally was, and now we all seem to, oh, by the way, USAID provided funds to Burisma,
Oh, really?
which
The
I read about
Ukrainian
today,
energy company?
that,
Yeah.
that hired Hunter Biden.
Yeah.
And that's
Huh.
what the infamous terrible call to Zelensky
Hmm.
was about. That's why he was impeached the first time because this Vindman character was detached. He was a Biden holdover that was detached, um, and it had access to this confidential call, and then he reported it, um, and was the star witness in impeachment one.
Yeah.
And USAID is all over that thing, um, and it's crazy. It's just crazy. So we'll see. I mean, there's probably like 100 different books that you can write
No, for
over
sure.
all the things that are going on now, and you just have to start like 20 years ago, and you were like, I can't believe this is the ending. How
Mm.
is this coming to this point in time? And
Yeah.
there's like all these threads going here, all these crazy people, and hopefully everything gets sorted out. But
Yeah.
it's a weird time, man.
Mm. Sure is. All right. Well, do you have any other final thoughts on this section of the book?
I don't. Do you have final thoughts? I've been going on a couple
Not
little
too.
rants.
No,
Yeah,
I I really enjoyed these articles, especially the last few. I think these were some of the best in the
yeah,
whole book that we've read so far, just in the topics he's talking about. With the freedom versus democracy, and then the judicial restraint argument there. And I think it really shows just how relevant he keeps being. This book was
yes,
published 15 years ago at least,
yes,
and a lot of the articles are written well before that.
yes.
And so it's like these things he's talking about maybe 25 years ago are still coming up again and again, and he still is correct about them, and he's still providing accurate thoughts that can be applied to all the situations we're in right now.
Yeah, that's why I think he is the America's best. He's still living, a
Hmm.
best living philosopher, social scientist. I mean, I don't know that they're certainly political philosopher. I don't know who's even close
Yeah.
to him. I mean, he's just brilliant, and that's his stuff holds up over time because he's succinct and he has a well thought out philosophy.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. All
Yes.
right. Well, if you have no other final thoughts, then this has been season 10, episode 10 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop, and I'm really looking forward to publicizing my thoughts on race and ethnicity, which is the next section.
Yeah, this might be an
Maybe we should
interesting
skip that one. It's still dangerous, even after Trump got elected.
Oh, that's true.
There's diversity,
Yeah.
all sorts of
Well,
stuff.
we'll see what our
Oh
listeners.
no, the slavery card. Oh gosh, we're in trouble. I think you should not comment. Minorities is the next one.
Oh, wow.
Race, romance, and reality. Oh my God, this is gonna be horrible.
Ah,
Yes,
it'll be all right. It's something to look forward to next time.
that's a teaser.